Hello, thank you for your interest in 2023 Community Housing Fund request for proposals also known as CHF RFP, and this webinar. I'm Karina Kopova, and today I have Erin Heron, James Forsyth, Mary Garius, and John Wu with me to discuss the CHF program, overview the RFP, speak about the next steps after application, and introduce other upcoming opportunities. Before we start the webinar, I would like to acknowledge that BC Housing is located on the ancestral homelands of hundreds of Indigenous peoples and nations across British Columbia, each with their own unique traditions and history. At this location, we are on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have been the caretakers of these lands for thousands of years. We offer our respect to their peoples, past and present. As mentioned in the beginning, today we will go over CHF program opportunities, overview the RFP structure, and speak about the next steps proponents can expect after submitting their responses, as well as discuss the upcoming opportunities. The CHF program was first introduced in 2018 by the province of British Columbia. The fund is $3.3 billion investment to build more than 20,000 affordable rental homes for people with moderate and low incomes by 2031-32. Approximately 9,000 of these homes are open or underway across the province. The CHF has received funds for an extra 6,000 new homes for families and seniors. Over the next 4 years, the plan is to issue more CHF proposal calls and allocate the remaining units. To respond to the question of who can apply, these are the nonprofit, cooperative, and municipal housing providers. Private partners are permitted to apply on behalf of nonprofit societies, Indigenous groups, cooperative, and municipal housing providers. For more details on how private partners can apply, please check the RFP's Appendix 9, Requirements and Deliverables. Organizations that are interested in applying for future proposal calls are encouraged to begin planning early. More details can be found on www.bchousing.org/chf-rfp, the address you can see on your screens, or reach out to your local BC Housing representative. There are 2 channels through which proponents can respond to CHF RFP, BC Bid and a dedicated email address. Proponents are encouraged to apply through BC Bid. However, there is also an opportunity to send applications through buildingbc@bchousing.org. Proponents shall choose one channel only and not duplicate their response by sending submissions through both channels. The next few slides will describe the RFP structure and go over the most critical parts of the RFP, such as Appendix 9, Requirements and Deliverables, which list the requirements that proponents are expected to fulfill, mandatory requirements, Appendix 6, which will discuss the evaluation criteria and process, Appendix 14, the response template, and we will talk in more detail about it in a moment. Submission locations, the way how proponents can send questions or inquiries, and RFP schedule. Appendix 9, Requirements and Deliverables, sets out CHF program requirements, as well as requirements to the proposed project, resilience and sustainability, financial contributions, requirements to housing providers, future operations, equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, referred to as EDIB, and reconciliation. Proponents are encouraged to examine Appendix 9 carefully to ensure that submissions contain relevant information to demonstrate that these requirements and deliverables can be met or exceeded. The next 2 slides will represent the unit designation established for CHF program, and I'll pass it over to Erin.
All right, thanks, Corinne. I am here to talk about one of the most interesting parts of the Community Housing Fund, and that is that it is a mixed income model. And so what that means is that there is a rather specific mix of resident incomes and rent models that needs to be achieved and maintained for these projects throughout the life of the project. In general, the breakdown is that 30% of the units are market rent units for moderate income households, and 70% of the units are rents geared to income with a mix of low income levels. I can talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. First, we'll start talking about the market units. So 30% of the units are effectively a rent on the door with a market rent that is initially approved by BC Housing, and it needs to be maintained at or above the CMHC average market rent for the community, and that's applicable to the units and the project. Marketing is really important. As stated, these are effectively market rent units for moderate income households. So providers need to be prepared to market and keep those units filled with effectively market rent tenants. The housing registry is a source of applicants. However, we recognize that it's often the case that there aren't sufficient applicants on the registry for market units. So absolutely, providers can market those units independently and select residents and bring them in without going through the housing registry process to ensure the units are filled with appropriate households that can afford the rents. In terms of eligibility, the main eligibility criteria is income. And as you can see on the slide, it's our moderate income limit, and income testing is only applied at move-in. And from there on, the tenancies are managed like any other standard rental tenancy. So the remaining 70% of the units are all rented on a rent geared to income basis with a split between two income levels. Specifically, we have 20% of the units for households with deep subsidy income, which means their income is below the deep subsidy threshold. You can see the figures on the screen there. In both categories, sort of regular RGI and deep subsidy, the rents are based on the applicable rent scale, and the rents charged are calculated each year based on the actual income of that household. The main difference between these two categories is that your deep subsidy units simply have a lower income threshold, and this is just to ensure a mix of incomes across all of the units and supports an income blending approach. For the purposes of the RFP, you will find that there are rent estimate tables for both RGI and deep subsidy. You may use those. Please remember those are just based on estimating the average income of households that would be living in those units. If you feel for your particular project that you won't be able to achieve those income levels, please be sure to include this information in your submission along with a rationale. Part B of the response template provides you space to provide any additional context or information on your proposed operating budget, and this would include the revenues, while staying, of course, within the constraints of the CHF program, but you can provide that information there on the response template. And now I'm going to hand it over to James.
Thank you so much, Erin. So for projects submitting for the CHF call, there's a number of mandatory requirements that we have, and we ask groups to please pay attention to section 4.1 of Appendix 9 in the RFP. For example, property tenure is a really important aspect of the projects. And so the land ownership needs to be determined and finalized and presented in the submissions. And we want to see projects that have fee simple, airspace parcel, or strata ownership. If, for example, a leasehold ownership is proposed, the lease registration may be in process, but that needs to be finalized already. Another example would be zoning. So we need to understand that the site is zoned correctly for the project, or that the conditions of rezoning can be satisfied and construction can commence within 18 months of project award. Another area of mandatory requirements is product design. And again, this is described in Appendix 9. And some of those examples might be energy modeling and thermal comfort analysis that would be looking to be completed. Accessibility requirements. So we would ask that 5% of all units are accessible. And then if a development consultant is engaged on the project, their agreement needs to be the standard form BC Housing Development Consultant Agreement and a copy attached to the submission. In addition to that, projects need to follow BC Housing's design guidelines. The last point I want to comment on with respect to this is the product description and capital budget and proponent teams. And so there's a lot of information that should be submitted as part of Appendix 14. Please don't submit separate spreadsheets or PDFs, but rather complete and use the Excel and Word documents that are available as part of the RFP. So next, we're going to talk about target populations. So the Community Housing Fund program was designed to support affordable housing for families and seniors and people with disabilities who can live independently. However, this does not preclude the program from serving other groups that need affordable housing, who may include women or women and children who are at risk of violence, youth aging out of care, supporting the continuum of housing for individuals leaving transitional or supportive housing that can live independently, or other groups that may align with the Community Housing Fund program. And so we ask all interested parties to put forward their submissions for affordable housing. Next, we'd like to talk about the funding that BC Housing provides. So part of the Community Housing Fund program, there's three main components of funding. Number one, we're going to provide capital grants to each project. These grants are based on the number of eligible residential units within the project. And for the purposes of this RFP, please use $158,294 per eligible dwelling unit. In addition to that, BC Housing can also provide financing for up to 100% of construction costs for the eligible components of the project, so the residential components that meet the affordability criteria. And this would include costs from idea through design and all the way to occupancy as well. Other sources of funding or financing may be added to the projects, but we're asking groups to utilize our interim and takeout financing at this point in time. And then finally, upon completion of the project and conversion of that interim financing into long-term financing, BC Housing will provide operating subsidies to offset net operating income shortfalls based on the long-term mortgages. And next, I'd like to hand it back over to Erin.
I'm going to briefly go through some highlights of these pieces and just a reminder to ensure that you're paying attention to all of the mandatory requirements and fully completing the response template and all the required information. These are just some highlights that I wanted to review today in terms of our organizational and proponent capacity and requirements. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is on organizational capacity. We know that taking on the ownership and operation of a new building for the long term is no small task. So we want to see the organization has the depth and experience to manage the project well to a high standard for the benefit of residents over the long term. We want to see information about your board of directors, leadership, and staff, showing that you have the capacity, experience, and knowledge to ensure the long-term success managing a rental property. And this would include everything from marketing of units, lease up and maintaining full occupancy, your property and asset management, your organizational management for everything through business continuity, financial management, governance, etc. And if there are gaps within your organization, how do you plan to close that gap so that you're prepared to operate the building successfully once it's complete? We also want to see a demonstrated ability to comply with funder requirements. So for those of you that have existing agreements with BC Housing, we ask you to confirm that you are in compliance with all of your existing agreements and confirm dates of submission for reporting such as financial statements and budgets. Details on all of this are in the submission template. Another key component you'll see is partnerships. We would like you to demonstrate how your organization works with others within the community, how you successfully create and manage those relationships. This includes how do you work respectfully with local Indigenous communities and rights holders. With property management, resident management, staffing, these are areas in the response template. There's a number of them. We want you to describe your planned approach to managing the property successfully over the long term. This includes your overall property management approach, your staffing model. How do you plan to address some key challenges of managing a rental property? This should including the market units, which may be new for some of our proponents. How will you market them and ensure that they're rented up in a timely fashion? How do you consider EDIB and support equity-seeking groups within your operating policies and practices as you plan to manage the building? How do you manage the long-term financial viability of the property? These are important areas, and we really want to see that you explain your approach in sufficient detail without writing a novel, but what's your approach to items such as preventive and requested maintenance, capital planning, resident selection, conflict management, etc. Details such as what components of your operations will be accomplished by employees versus contractors. This is important information. When it comes to your operating budget, what's most important is we want to see that all of the figures that you provide in your operating budget are based on a solid rationale to the very best of your ability. Estimates are fine, but we want to be sure that you provide the basis for those estimates that's based on your specific proposed project, your operating model, and your target clientele. For example, a line like service contracts. Be clear what's included in your service contracts line versus other lines, such as maintenance. Which contracts are included and how much did you estimate for each contract? What was that based on? Have you factored in, for example, any new technologies compared to other buildings that will require regular service contracts versus being maintained by in-house staff? All important details to consider. In summary, what we really want to see is that the proposed project that you've brought forward, so the building form, the location, the target residence, all of those pieces align with a well-articulated operating plan, which in turn is well aligned with your operating budget. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mary.
So, with respect to equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, ultimately, what we're looking for is for proponents to share information with us about how they integrate values of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging into their projects, policies, and processes. We're looking to see if you reflect equity and right-seeking communities that you serve in your board composition or employee makeup. Whether you consider the principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and reconciliation in the development of your organizational policies, processes, and practices. Do you target programs to equity-seeking organizations? Or do you have partnerships with service providers who have a deep and intimate knowledge of the needs of equity-seeking and right-seeking communities and community members who would be your prospective tenants? With respect to reconciliation, what we're looking for you to share is whether you as an organization and proponent are Indigenous owned, and whether, if not, you integrate Indigenous values and an understanding of Indigenous cultures and cultural sensitivity as part of your practice in operating housing. We also look for you to share if you've considered Indigenous engagement as part of your development process, engaging with local First Nations, Métis communities, Indigenous communities and service providers, and how often you do that in practice, perhaps in previous housing that you've operated or developed. We're also looking for you to share if you've considered community benefits, Indigenous community benefits with respect to training Indigenous individuals or having subcontracting arrangements with Indigenous owned vendors. Anything that you're willing to share with us about your journey around reconciliation would be of benefit for us to know as part of your submission.
Thank you, Mary. A couple of next slides, we will again talk about the mandatory requirements because they are quite critical for this RFP and would like to provide more information about it. As observed in previous slides, this RFP has established a number of mandatory requirements, which you can check in RFP document section 4.1. Apart from mandatory requirements such as submission time, submission location, and response template in Appendix 14, there are also mandatory requirements to proposed project stage, proposed project design, and proponents, housing providers. Proponents must meet all of the mandatory requirements to proceed to the next stage of evaluation. Sections 4.1, 4.2, and 5.1 of the RFP Appendix 9 requirements and deliverables will have more details about those mandatory requirements. In this slide, we're going to walk you through the evaluation criteria and process. Appendix 6 contains information about how submissions will be scored and proponents selected. There are 6 categories of rated criteria. On the left side of this table, you can see the description of each category, and on the right side, there are weightings assigned to each category. All compliant submissions which met mandatory requirements will be evaluated against this rated criteria. Please note that for the two largest categories, proposed project profile and operations planning capability, capacity, and financial viability, there are minimum thresholds established for this criteria. Proponents should collect 16% at a minimum for each of the mentioned criteria, 32 in total, to proceed to the rest of the evaluation process. For more details, please check Appendix 6, Evaluation Criteria and Process of the RFP, which incorporates the rated criteria, weightings, minimum thresholds, and detailed description of information proponents are expected to include in their submissions. In this slide, we will walk you through the Appendix 14 response template. A response template has been designed by BC Housing to help proponents structure their responses and include information required to produce strong submissions. The response template is included as Appendix 14 and has two parts represented with two separate files, Part A in Excel format and Part B in Word format. Part A contains 5 tabs, which are Project Profile, including responses to mandatory requirements set out for project stage, project design, and housing providers, Risk Registry, Capital Budget, Operating Budget, and PDF Budget, only for proponents choosing to apply to PDF. All tabs, as well as all line items in Part A, must be completed. Proponents are required to submit Part A in Excel format. Please ensure that Part A is not converted to other formats. Part B consists of responses intended to be provided for rated categories such as operations planning, EDIB, and reconciliation. Proponents must provide responses in the form of a narrative, making sure that the limited space allocated in Part B responses is used strategically to include project-specific responses and limit the amount of generic or vague responses. And with that, let me hand it over to James to continue on the process of project selection.
So we are looking really forward to all the submissions that are going to be sent on or before November 17th at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I highly encourage everyone to get their submissions in before that deadline and hopefully well in advance. With respect to the review and approval process, once BC Housing receives all the submissions, we're going to review every single one of them to ensure that the mandatory requirements are met. For products that do meet those requirements, then they will move on to a detailed evaluation. And this evaluation is based on all of the requirements that we set out in Appendix 9 and the evaluation criteria set out in Appendix 6. Once evaluations are complete, then BC Housing will provide notification to all groups who have submitted, and successful projects will be provided a notice of award. This then completes and closes out the RFP process. Once the RFP is closed, then BC Housing staff will engage with those successful proponents. We'll start to onboard CHF projects into BC Housing's typical approval processes. And this would include kickoff meetings and presenting of updated information. Subsequent to the closeout and those kickoff meetings, then projects will follow BC Housing's typical approval processes, whereby submissions will be presented to executive committees or other levels of government to seek PDF funding, provisional project approval once the project has advanced to a sufficient stage, and then also final project approval once projects are ready to move into construction. So next steps and funding allocations. So in May 2023, the province announced the Housing Supply Act. The provincial government, through this act, is taking action to deliver more homes faster. And the Community Housing Fund is going to align with the Housing Supply Act and the priority communities that were announced at that time. This includes the city of Abbotsford, Delta, Kamloops, North Vancouver, Oak Bay, Port Moody, Saanich, Vancouver, Victoria, and West Vancouver. So these communities are priority through the Community Housing Fund. In addition to that, BC Housing wants to ensure there's regional parity, as affordable housing is an important thing throughout the entire province and is evident through municipal needs assessments. Now, we wish that absolutely every single project could be funded. However, we know that the program allocations under this RFP will be limited. So in our selection process, first, we want to make sure that projects are meeting or exceeding those mandatory requirements. And then we'll be looking at the highest ranked proponents under the priority communities for funding, and then continuing to make selections for highest ranking projects outside of those communities to ensure that we achieve regional parity. So next, I want to hand it back to John.
Thank you, James. The CHF 2023 tender call was released on August 28. For this tender call, proponents are requested to submit their proposals through either BC Bid, which is preferred method, or through email to buildingbc@bchousing.org. Please choose one submission location, not both. This slide shows the RFP schedule for this tender call. You can also find it in section 2.3 of the IP document. Please make sure give yourself sufficient time to prepare and submit a proposal. The submission deadline for this tender call is November 17, 2023 by 2 p.m. Late submission will not be accepted. During the tender call, proponents should submit any IP-related questions through email to buildingbc@bchousing.org by the deadline for questions, which is October 10th, 2023 at 2 p.m. BC Housing will prepare addenda to include responses to the questions and post it prior to the addendum deadline, which is October 23rd, 2023. Please note, inquiries through other channels will not be responded. In addition to the Community Housing Fund, CHF, BC Housing will have funding opportunities across many populations. Indigenous Housing Fund, IHF, Supportive Housing Fund, SHF, and Women's Transition Housing Fund, WTHF, will all be rolled out in the near future. We strongly recommend you access your organization's capacity and choose the best funding opportunity for the organization. Thank you for watching Building BC Community Housing Fund 2023 webinar. We are looking forward to your participation in this opportunity.